I'll start with giving a little bit of introduction to my body of work. When I was 8, I was given a cassette recorder and I started recording environmental sound with it. First thing I was recording was my mother singing, and I noticed at that age, when I was coming close to my mother singing, the room was less recorded, and when I was going backwards, a bit distant, the object of her voice was recorded less and the room was coming into room was registered more. The spatiality of sound was incepted in my mind from that moment. That's the crucial moment when what sound experiments or sound art has as it's defined. Sound art practice was something I started thinking about. So when I joined the film school, I specialized in sound recording. I was somehow disillusioned with the industrial educational system in the film school, and I started working autonomously or independently with sound, primarily field recordings. The first work I produced was Landscaping Metamorphosis, a CD produced by Raum Recorder in Germany. It was a recording of a landscape which was undergoing industrialization, and the tribal populace was displaced and dispossessed. I'll play a little clip from that first CD that was produced, and that was my first release. So my first works, earlier works were based on field recordings I made from the environment, different kind of sites I encountered, primarily industrial, also affected by displacement of people, tribal populace. In 2010, I was invited to Bangalore for a residency, and that residency helped me to produce a new work called Eye Contact with the City. I recorded primarily 3 layers of a city, Indian city, which I never visited before, Bangalore, which was going through at that moment dynamic metamorphosis because metro rail construction was happening. So I recorded the metro rail construction, the underground construction sites, and I found out through the research of the archival materials I found in the city, many spool tapes. And those spool tapes were primarily 50s and 60s recordings from homes. And I found the room tones of 50s and 60s. And that was the secondary layer of the composition. And the third layer was the vibrations of different surfaces, architectural surfaces of the city. I play a little clip from the project. It was a installation version as well as composition. There was a composition which was released by Grain Recorder again. I play a little clip from the composition. The project was installed as dismantling a sound work in 6 easy steps. My first solo exhibition in Akusmata, Helsinki, 2012. During the residency in Bangalore in 2010 and 11, I was also developing another project, which was called The Well-Tempered City. I was primarily listening to the user-generated content of the city, the citizens and their movements on the surfaces of the city, how the different kinds of vibrations they produce. And I was using a transducer to transform these vibrations into sound signals. And I will perform tonight the second piece. You already have the program notes with you, this piece tonight. The Well-Tempered City, which was premiered at in 2 Days Art Festival in The Hague, 2014. In 2008, I moved to Europe, and I was working in collaboration with a number of artists from Italy, and for my master's exchange program, I was living in Firenze, Florence. And the first piece of work I produced in Firenze was the title is Passage to the City. I was primarily looking at the inaudible sound content, the resonant frequency of the city through a device I produced. Device was primarily a microphone array with a speaker system. And through acrobatic movement within the city, it was produced feedback. And the feedback I measured and I captured and computed into a composition. to the city was presented in Trondheim for the first time. In 2014, I was invited to be part of an exhibition titled Mind Your Own Dizziness. I produced the installation in Transmediale and then in a gallery in Copenhagen. Mind Your Own Dizziness was my first work with sound object. I'll come to how I defined sound object and object disorientation of sound later, but this was my first work with so-called sound object and questioning the object specificity of sound and whether that is debatable. A Day in the Life of a Listener was a group exhibition called Listenings in the Contemporary Art Gallery in Medellin. Decomposing landscape. It was a long-term project I was developing from 2010 onwards through various occasions of field recordings in environmentally and ecologically troubled landscape in South Asia, India, and some other countries. And I'll present this piece tonight in the second part of the concert. Decomposing Landscape was premiered at the Donau Festival in Krems. And I also presented this piece in different contexts. Last year, I had an exhibition of this piece in Wellkuhn Zimmer in Düsseldorf. Arithmetic of Distance is another work I'm developing. It's a work in progress based on my recordings in Europe for the last 10 years. Also, Exile and Other Syndromes, which is currently in research, and also I exhibited this piece in different contexts, primarily in the Screen City Biennial in Norway, 2017. With live visuals which are generative in nature, taking into consideration the contemplation of a nomadic listener in a contemporary city. And these writings, these contemplations are scribbled down on notes as notes, and those notes are digitized and fed into a generative algorithm through which the notes become augmented with the sound. So where sound and the texts are wired together. So at this moment I'm with 3-channel stage, but the final version of the work will be 4-channel live visuals and 16-channel sound live projection. Talking Frame is a project I'm currently involved in developing. It was presented at ZKIM. It's a kind of sound object, but interactive sound object which responds to the viewer or the listener and the relative position of the viewer in front of the canvas. It's an empty canvas with visual information withdrawn, and through this withdrawal of the visual information, I'm trying to engage the viewer and enhance his or her listening capacities. And also at the same time, I'm trying to refocus the center from the object to the perceiver. The perceiver's relative position will generate sound in the canvas, and sound that is spilling over the framing of the object. So the spillover of sound, which cannot be kept or framed within an artistic object, that is one of my arguments. I'm also looking at the question that sound exhibition, as an exhibitory context, sound is not a medium that can be exhibited. So sound exhibition, or sound art exhibition, this phrase I'm trying to unpack and deconstruct. Another current project, which will be published from errant bodies in Berlin, is A Nomad's Guide to Listening. It's a book and reading project, augmented book, with publication and embedded with audio. Towards an Amicable End is a work I started composing in Beirut when I encountered the abandoned houses and different memories of the war and destruction. Primarily the abandoned dome in Tripoli. So this work was trying to capture the violence and the decolonization of listening experience and war and the kind of a sense of a doomsday. So I'm trying to invite the listener to accept the doomsday through a kind of an amicable end. So this project is very personal in nature, and I didn't yet perform, but hope to do a live performance of the entire composition in the future. This is an image from a concert in Rabat where I just introduced the piece. It's in progress. Another work I would like to present kind of as a last slide is Dwani, which is a Sanskrit word meaning resonance. It will be premiered in the Experimental Arts and Science Biennale. And this is a work developed through research in machine learning and AI. Number, as you can see, hundreds of bells, temple bells. There would be different versions of the project with other sounding objects, traditional sounding objects such as wind chimes, South Asian wind chimes, temple bells, and different kinds of musical instruments which are sound producing objects. I will take the sound producing object as something which can be augmented, where the kind of expanded object using AI and machine learning as something that is expanding the possibility of the sounding object, such as the swarm nature of the entire system, because each of these sounding objects are connected together through invisible wires, and every time it is one object is moving, the entire system is moving and producing sounds. And as you can understand, any sounding object will fade out through loss of energy. So what AI is doing, AI is learning the environment and the ambient sound and the decay of the entire system, and it compensates through an actuator. So that the entire system moves continuously. So this is my contemporary work, and I already showed you a few slides from my earlier works. There is a shift, as one can look at, from acousmatic and field recording based works to more object specific work. So this shift is something I'm trying to theorize in my work. When I'm an artistic researcher, so I analyze my work often, and by self-critique, I'm trying to understand how the question of sound and space and object are making a kind of trigonal relationship in my work. And I'm also questioning, as I said, the sound object itself and how the object of sound can be expanded through different kinds of technological, human, and machinic manipulations. These are the different different traits of questioning I'm trying to incorporate in my work. So here I stop, giving you a bit of glimpse of my body of work. I'll move to the second part of the presentation, of the workshop, and where I'll argue for sound from the global south, in the sense that there is a rift between the way sound art is, the idea of sound art is construed and sound practice is understood in the global north, and the different kinds of methodologies and practices existing in the global south, particularly South Asia, Southeast Asia, North Africa, Middle East. I have been doing field work, ethnography, for the last 2 years. And I'll present some of the interviews I conducted. But before I go to the interview, I'll present a text for this presentation I produced, I have written. Connecting Resonances, Sonic Perspectives from the Global South. In the arts and humanities, sound studies have rapidly established itself as vibrant and productive academic field, resulting in a profusion of scholarly as well as artistic works around a wider range of practices. 3 consecutive compendia, such as the Routledge Sound Studies Reader, the Oxford Handbook of Sound Studies, and the Routledge Companion to Sound Studies, have been complemented with Journal of Sonic Studies, the New Soundtrack, and a number of other peer-reviewed journals that are entirely dedicated to the studies of sound. These publications show that now sound studies indeed is a relevant area of research, receiving wider academic attention within the broader context of new media, cultural studies, media art history, film and media studies. Notwithstanding this rapidly growing body of work, much of the attention has been invested in studying sound within an American or European musical or media cultural context. Sound in other contexts, for example, in the South Asia, Middle East, and Africa, broadly known as parts of the global south, have largely remained underexplored. Although this part of the globe is one of the world's largest producers of film and audiovisual media, such as India, with a formidable presence as emerging giants in film, media arts, and cultural production. Writing a comprehensive and decolonized, I'll come to this term later. What do I mean by decolonization in sound and listening? Decolonized history of the media arts in the global south, especially focusing on sound, has not been attempted, largely remaining underexplored and ignored critically. The works regularly discussed in sound and media studies are canonized in the global community of researchers by the sheer amount of citations and reviews, but they have a negligible number of contributions from the global south. There is a serious lack of representation of the researchers from the vast and diverse landscape of the global south in the bibliographic resources and reference list of these works. For example, Routledge Companion to Sound Studies have no contributors from the global south. In the Oxford Handbook of Sound Study, there is one writer from China. The Sound Studies Reader has one contributor from India. In keywords in sound, there is no contributor originally born and studying in the global south. So nobody representing global south, mostly in these series of books I showed here. They are canonized and they are classics in sound studies, so to speak. One concerned with this problem of exclusion may lament that sound and media studies indeed is overwhelmingly northbound. In other words, Eurocentric. And this geologic conservatism is limiting the field's research and social outreach. It is an act of complacent ignorance not to engage with African and Asian artists and thinkers regarding their rich auditory cultures. while many of their works are now available in translation, such as in the Harvard Oriental series. John Stuart Mill noted, "He who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that." I'm inspired by my fellow colleagues and peers from all parts of the globe, and personally grateful to some of them for their sympathetic ears. But as a young researcher, I cannot help but be concerned about this unfair social divide that I feel must be addressed. In my work, both as a sound artist and researcher, I have endeavored to bridge this gap in my capacity. Much work needs to be made in pushing the horizons and shifting the perspectives of the field of sound studies. However, the untoward resistances my kind of young scholars from other cultural and intellectual traditions usually meet make it difficult to be read widely, let alone be canonized. It is to note here, as many scholars such as Brandon Lovell have argued, sound's socially associative and relational capacity as a medium better navigates by connecting worlds rather than dividing. Addressing this concern about an unfair social divide, my current postdoctoral research intends to create a fertile entry point to understand the unique sonic sensibility and sound aesthetics of the Global South. Such new knowledge fundamentally shifts the perspectives in sound studies and within a universal history of sound and listening. In specific, the research intends to develop a comprehensive understanding of the unique sounds of the film and audiovisual media, radio works, and media art productions in India as a representative part of the so-called Global South. The term itself is debatable, since it's a colonial construct. The term Global North is rarely used. The use of the West is more commonplace. Likewise, there is a lack of egalitarianism here. It can also be debated that the very diverse groups or nations cannot be put together under a singular geological umbrella of Global South. And hence there is a necessity to be specific in the inquiry to find the critical interlinking of nations and cultures towards a decolonial global order, going beyond the idea of a third world. The project therefore examines the historical developments of sound practice after the advent of the recording technology in the media production in Global South at the end of 19th century, and the corresponding aesthetic shifts in media arts as well as in sound practice in South Asia, Middle East, and North Africa, some of the world's largest producer of film and audiovisual media, joined by a common history of cultural imperialism and economic exploitation by European colonialism, most of which were dismantled and independence achieved around 1950s and 60s through often homegrown resistance against a violent oppression. Here, sound practice refers to the wider activity with sound, ranging from everyday and human-made sounds to producing and making music and sound inside a studio, for example, film. By approaching this yet undocumented ethnography, I aim to re-examine a fundamental issue in the studies of a colonial model of modernity concerned with the cultural and technological transmission from the West to the East and from the North to the South, but not in the other way around. The investigation is focused on understanding why sounding media technology-based artworks such as sound art and digital music, film and video art installation works in the Global South have a belated emergence and a shorter history, although having a deep-rooted cultural auditory culture, by critically engaging with the trajectories of sound practice. The primary argument is that given the spatio-temporally distinct nature of traditional art in Global South, for example South Asia, this unlikely emergence can be seen as an East-West confluence that started at the end of 19th century through cultural and artistic exchanges and technological interactions. I'm examining if this confluence is mutually enriching interaction between the East and the West, and whether it was undermined by Europe's colonial pursuits with a domineering tendency. And the nature of this confluence is traced by an in-depth literature review and analyzing a wider range of relevant sound practices, from films to musical and artistic productions that involve media technology, such as sound recording. Such use of modern technology is negotiated often within traditionally oral and temporally non-linear music and sound culture to counter the culturally imperialist pressure of the West, asking to follow certain technological frameworks and medial dispositives. This approach helps understanding the intensified confluence of methodologies owing to the early globalization, producing new knowledge in the studies of modernity and critical exchanges and confluence between the Eastern and the Western artistic and cultural traditions with a decolonial approach. Secondly, popular media culture and the audiovisual media from the global South are often undermined in the West for producing transcendental sound experiences, exemplified by an overwhelming use of atemporal song and dance sequences exercised in South Asian films such as the notorious Bollywood. In this practice, careful incorporation and attentive organization of sounds are often considered being ignored in the narrative strategy, producing a loud and lack of nuanced soundtrack. There are many examples from film, music, and media artworks from South Asia in which mindful sound production is not apparent. Often a loud and high-pitched auditory setting is meant to produce a remote and imaginary sonic landscape. Challenging this popular preconception in the larger public, I am aiming to demonstrate that this generalized perception of sound aesthetics in South Asia and other parts of Global South might be erroneous if we consider the historical trajectories of sound production as opposed to exporting an essentialist typecast. The advent of digital technology makes it possible to incorporate rich layers of sound in the production schemes and organization, also apparent in the current range of works produced in digital realms with a critical approach to Eurocentric sound. For example, through microtonal experiments, exploration of the acoustic properties of materials found in Japanese live performances, Aki Onda is one example. Participatory and community listening projects and harsh noise performances such as in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia. So the question for me is, how is the sound practice different from its northern equivalents in the various parts of the Global South? Given that the name of Global South is quite a recent formation and it is largely construed while responding to the post-colonial perspectives. How do the sound cultures of this geologic counterpart of the West or Global North with a colonial history respond to the current milieu of decolonization? These questions are rarely asked in the contemporary studies of sound. Film, music, and auditory cultural productions from the non-West are often typecast without receiving thorough critical assessment. Often the academic attention they receive is through westernized lenses and a listening ear of canonized scholarship tinted with modernity. However, there have been fundamental incompatibilities between the transcendental, timeless, non-perspectival, non-linear, and improvisational nature of performing arts and music in India and other parts of South Asia, and the temporal, spatial, and technological constraints of the modernist recording practice introduced in South Asia, Middle East, and Africa by the erstwhile colonial powers like British Empire in the early part of the century. No wonder the practitioners of Indian classical music in India and Arabic classical composers, performers in Lebanon and Cairo, Egypt, for example, were deeply skeptical about recording their rendition on the media. For example, cylinders and shellac discs introduced by the British and French ethnomusicologists, primarily because of such aesthetic incongruences. However, Indian films and music production gradually embraced the recording practices and assimilated the Western modernist influence in the production aesthetics. How were these confluences developed, and how to trace these critical intersections between artistic traditions, thoughts, and practices? How do we gauge the profound ramifications of the Western modernity in the trajectory of sound practice in the Global South? Did these critical interventions manifest in the way sound was produced? How do these reflect in the contemporary production and practices? These are respectively the main and sub-questions of my research, which considers that spatiotemporal disruption caused by the advent of sound recording technology as a crucial point of departure to study cultural exchanges and artistic melange between the East and the West, or North and the South, with a focus on the sound production practice as a key area of Global South. In India, in India and Middle East and North Africa as a key areas of Global South, by learning through the voices of the practitioners in the ethnographic interviews conducted in the project. The varied sonic perspectives from the Global South can be traced by historical analysis of sound used in relevant film, music, and media artworks that draw on the diverse epistemologies of the Global South. Complementarily, I investigate the artistic process that involves sound recording technology tending to negotiate traditionally oral and temporally non-linear auditory culture of Global South in order to conform to the culturally imperialist pressure of the European powers since the colonial period through the course of 20th century. I support the above claim by bringing into foreground relevant scholarly research from the largely ignored but important ancient scholars such as Anandavardhana and Abhinavagupta, to the contemporary researchers like N.C. Nanda and so on. I take into account their relevant scholarly perspectives, often underexplored, in order to conduct an innovative literature review that traces the intersections and resonances with the scholarly perspectives of the West. There is indeed a wealth of scholarly literature on sound and listening to be found in the field of aesthetic theory in the Global South since ancient times. And it will be unfair to term it as mere indigenous knowledge from a predominantly Western perspective through an othering of culture. In Indian aesthetic theory alone, the topic of subjectivity and selfhood embedded in sonic phenomena has been discussed in depth. From S.S. Berlingler's writings, we know about the concept of spota, which indicates the sound changes into subjective thinking and language and acquires meaning only after a certain explosion of sound, as part of a self-involved mental association in listening. Anandavardhana, as you can see, his treatise called Dhanaloka, which is meant the light of sound. Anandavardhana was the author of Dhanaloka, translated in the light of sound, a work articulating the philosophy of aesthetic suggestion. It was written circa 820, 890, and later, philosopher Abhinavagupta, circa 950, 1000, wrote an important commentary on it, the Lokana, the eye. Both of the works, they articulate the philosophy of aesthetic suggestion. Anandavardhana is credited with creating the Dwani theory, resonance theory. He wrote that Dwani, meaning sound or resonance, is a soul or essence of human expression, such as a song or poetry. When the poet writes, said Anandavardhana, he creates a resonant field of emotions. To understand the poetry, the reader or hearer must be on the same wavelength. The method requires sensitivity on the parts of the writer and the reader and the listener. Dhanaloka, together with Abhinavagupta's commentary on it, the eye, Lokana, have been translated into English by the eminent Sanskrit scholar Daniel Ingalls and his collaborators in India. Another important addition to the studies of sound is the idea of Rasa. In the domain of sound and listening, Rasa is realized when the self assumes a poetic mood with a reflective attitude in listening by engaging with the indirect or descriptive knowledge of the sound event, rather than with a direct knowledge as mere vibration and wave. This is said to be one of its higher modes of being and listening in different moods. A number of Indian philosophers and aesthetic theorists divided the sonic subject in terms of Dwani, sound heard by the ear, and Spota, sound grasped by the intellect, recognizing sound's multiple possible interpretations upon listening. Indian rhetoricians have made meticulous studies of both the meaning and emotive context of sound. According to them, sounds have at least two meanings. One literal meaning, which is described as dhvani, and the other suggested meaning, echoing the literal meaning of sound but going beyond it to accommodate the emotive context of the listener, as spota, or bursting out of energy, when a multitude of sonic associations are released upon its locative occurrence, and further in the listener's mind, grasping it in subjective contemplations. This perspective on the multiplicity of sound interpretation may help understanding the issues related to perception of sound. This multiplicity of sonic interpretation helps to create new knowledge around the issues of subject, object, self, other, inner and outer, illuminating the thoughtful, contemplative states potentially generated inside the itinerant mind of the listener. This perspective also opens up a new discourse in sound studies, where notions of chance, contingency, subjectivity, and non-linear temporalities are given significance, and the role of the listener is deemed crucial in the trajectory of a sound event and its travels. A comparative study in Oriental and Occidental perspectives, such as the Philosophy East and West Journal, postcolonial studies like Spivak, Chatterjee and Puha, helps critically examining the philosophical and methodological conflicts, rifts, intersections and confluences between global North and global South in the field of sound and listening. In this light, one may refer to the writings of Marshall McLuhan, 1962 and 1975, on the binaries of visual literary culture of the West versus audible, tactile, sensorial, oral cultures of the East, emphasizing on the dialectics between improvisation in the Western tradition and writing, recording, precomposing with sound in the Western, where McLuhan suggested that oral cultures are inferior. Quote. Taking into consideration the yet untapped and underexplored body of scholarship, as I mentioned, such as the slide here, this book. In the aesthetic theories and epistemologies of the Global South and its conflicts and confluences with the canonized and often saturated body of work in sound studies in the Global North, it is observed that the aesthetic shifts in sound practice in the light of technological innovations underscore complex interplays between the Western hegemony of technology, pressuring to embrace modernity, and the emergence of a syncretic, hybrid, and assimilated form with traditionalist traces. For example, in Bollywood films, Tollywood films in Nigeria, or Hong Kong films, in South Korea films, different kinds of methodologies in filmmaking, for example, from the Global South. Also music and media arts that negotiated the epistemology of the Global South around notions like Dwani, Spota, and Rasa, which stand apart from the idea of epistemology in the Global North. And such knowledge are colonized by Europe's modernist pressures of linear progression, technological innovations, cultural othering, and building up social hierarchy by imperialism since the end of 19th century in many parts of Global South. The contemporary decolonial moment is an appropriate context for a rewriting of this history, bringing into focus unheard scholarly and artistic voices and practices. These diverse aesthetic practices with sound is traced through an ethnographic study of pre-modern sound practice indigenously made before the advent of Western technologies, and contemporary practice with sound in the Global South. Tracing such broad and inclusive trajectory of practices helps to locate significant and representative sounds that carry the evidence of the shifts. The unique sound worlds of the representative parts of Global South is understood through extensive interviews and in-depth conversations with prominent practitioners. I'll play now a few excerpts from the interviews I conducted with sound practitioners from mostly Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, Morocco, India, Hong Kong, and Southeast Asia, Indonesia, for example. I think if you look, the question of reality in music is very different in the two traditions. There is an objective reality, focus on and fascination with the objective reality, which is tangible reality in Western tradition. So songs or music or any kind of sound, organized sound, organized around a particular kind of reality which is objective. Yeah. And the program music. Most music in Western tradition is program music. Yeah. It depicts something, it delineates something. But in Eastern traditions, particularly Arabic tradition, Indian tradition, or Chinese traditions, Japanese music also, this there is a division. The idea of reality is then broken down, fragmented. One is a religious reality and there is experience reality. So the different parts of reality is considered and acknowledged. So that is the reason music reflects this kind of fragmentation. There is an abstract vision of music that you go deeper into a note, like Makam, 72 different scales. Is going deeper into the possibilities of a particular tone. This is absent in Western tradition. So I'm thinking about whether your approach when you started working with doing music and doing sound, are you thinking in this line? You are getting influenced because the question I'm trying to reach or trying to address is decolonization. Decolonization because I was taking notes and I found an interesting thing that during 20th century, the 72 scales of Makam was squeezed into 24 because Western tradition could not handle 72. So is it not a kind of colonizing of the sound?
Definitely. I mean, even in and this is a very big problem we face, as I noticed that we all face at some point here when we tried to do Arabic music, and we did it from a self-exoticizing manner. So when we say, okay, I will play Arabic music, I start playing a scale, the harmonic minor, immediately. But this was just like the scale that differentiated, that was very characteristic of the Arab music, Arabic music, and that could actually be played on the keyboard, and not exactly with the difference of intervals, like a bit narrower, and the second augmented is larger. So yeah, we all kind of face this self-exoticism when we wanted to do Arabic music. But then I started thinking about, like, other than reality, it's also like our experience of time in both traditions.
Yes. Time.
And time in Arabic music is very, like, it could be cyclical and it could just be free. And it doesn't need to be confined within measures.
Absolutely.
And this is what I have been experimenting with my looper actually, which is, I found this dichotomy very interesting because the looper just loops a certain fragment and it loops it forever. But how can I challenge this machine and actually make it work as a free instrument? And this is when I started composing stuff that is much linked to language and less linked to a specific rhythmical measure. So Yeah, I always think of like my relationship to time, my relationship to textures, the voice versus harmonies, or if there are any harmonies, or how music follows language or vice versa. If the language is squeezed into a certain rhythmical structure. So all these questions. Yeah, it's kind of a way to liberate my music from what I know or what I was taught to think, like the way I was taught to think.
So you are framing this as self-exoticization?
Not this. The actual fact of working with Arabic music in a very shallow manner, which I stopped doing, but just like doing the harmonic minors or doing a certain beat that's very like specific to dance, to Oriental dancing. This is sometimes what people would refer to as Arabic, especially from the West, but this has nothing to do with, this is just one bit of Arabic music and it doesn't define Arabic music. So I was
That was Yumna Sawa from Beirut.
I would like to ask you about there is a canon or sound canon, scholarly canon or musical canon based on sonic practices historically in the Middle East. Do you see there is a canon?
Yeah.
There is a canon.
Some people don't think so, but I think in the last 10 years it's being formed. I think musically more than sonically, let's say there are specific sounds per se for the Middle East or for the Middle Eastern scene, but it's not extremely defined. I'm talking sound in terms of physical, like in terms of physics, not in terms of like sound as a metaphor of music. But in music composition, any kind of dealing with music and dealing with effects that creates music, there is like a common ground between different musicians, how they compose, how they deal with music. So it ends up creating this sound. But how I understand sound, I understand it totally from a physical environment. I don't understand sound as strictly music. I understand the sound as like sound art practice, as the city, as violence. It's not the same in the whole Middle East. In Lebanon there is a very, very, very particular signature. But we're different from the all other places. But musically we're starting to have similarities, which is interesting. Which is interesting in parts of like thanks to like different musicians, thanks to different people that were like experimenting, thanks to different people that were like trying to understand or trying to think about stuff that when you were young you were questioning why they weren't happening, and when we were growing older we started witnessing people doing like questions about like, okay, so the use of like Arabic maqams or like Arabic tempos or stuff like that, or Arabic influences, why weren't they like deployed or weren't they more like experimented with? But slowly we're seeing like so many acts like toward Dragon or that one hymn, Jerusalem in my heart, or even like collaborations between different musicians, mainly under Irtijal.
There was Muhammad Safa talking about canons in Arabic musical and sonic practices.
Passing over time. So as an artist, a practitioner from India, do you think you have certain bias or certain fascination or certain inclination towards sound and listening approaches?
Listening approaches, yes. Bias, not really.
Or inclination?
Inclination, yes, definitely. I am very much inclined towards the Indian architecture, like these structures, caves, temples, to be very precise. these temples, these caves were chiseled with hand, without machineries or like instruments. Like it's basic instruments or hand tools. A very acute understanding was present in terms of how this space would morph the sound, how this space would influence the perception, how this space would influence the experience. So, temples, for example, many, like there's a wide range of temples which were specifically designed to host performances. So the space or the position of a mridangam player or a nagara player, the drone tanpura player, the vocalist was very much decided with the simple idea of knowing the response of the instrument, how that instrument would interact with the architecture, and how that as whole would project itself as an image, acoustical image, and what sort of resonances or the image would be perceived from the outside. So many of these temples at their peak would resonate as a structure. So as a individual, this experience is larger than life, the entire structure resonating.
But what is different? Because this is the same kind of architectural acoustics developed in Greece, for example, in some temple acropolis.
Oh yes, so here the difference is acute understanding of instrumentation, the response, and the overall image. But the core similarity, which is found across all places of worship, be it a mosque, church, cathedral, temple, anything, which is the simple idea of resonance. Resonance, not giving attention to speech in tangibility. Being able to comprehend spoken word is not needed, but if there is a high reverberation or there is a high amount of resonance, this purely triggers a sense of spirituality, or this idea triggers a sense of larger than life image.
So this is the core of
This is the core fundamental understanding which I think designers understood all across the world, and this is a very basic human nature, which is resonance is somewhat correlated to spirituality.
But it is different, the ways this resonance is constructed in architectural spaces is different in Eastern tradition.
Yes, in Greece it's the social experience or the lived experience which the designer wanted was totally different. In churches it was designed for these young boys singing in something, they should sound like angels. So the church organ, so these spaces were.
That was Akash Sharma.
Conversation is to understand I locate three different parameters in non-Western sound practice. Sound practice in the global south, like oud, for example, from Syria, or Lebanese music, or Arabic music in general, Indian music, Chinese music. They have their separate kind of cultural practice, but they have a commonality. This commonality comes from primarily three different parameters. One is time. We discuss time. I'll go deeper with you in this discussion later. Time, space, and subjectivity, like personality, as we say, personality. So these are very different from a Western cultural practice.
Western culture?
Western culture. In the Western, like in Europe.
Yes. So it's clear in the Western more than the Eastern music.
Not clear, but it's a different way of looking at it. Like time is linear in the West. You have a beginning and you have an end. Like you already said, it's narrative drama.
This Hollywoodization.
Hollywoodization. It's like in Hollywood film, if we think of cinema as one of the cultural production, there is one beginning and there is one end.
It's a code.
It's a code.
Story, like story.
Like a story. It's a code.
Yes.
And this code is different when it comes to non-West, like Arabic music, for example.
Ah, yes. Yes.
So my interest is to know how you look at these things, how you look at time in your work.
Time. Yes.
Personality, how you look at personality, how your personality, your more like subjective.
The time in usual?
In your work.
In my work, in my music.
And in
The time is like, for me, it's like every note has vibe. So I believe like this vibe, it takes its time. So I focus on this, on my playing on the wood, like to give the really the vibe. Like for me, the time is like how to suppress the vibe. That's how for me.
vibe.
The vibe of the wave, the vibe of the music, the notes. So like as example, if I want to do like dum, this vibe, like I want to stay here. So the time is something like it means the feeling, the feel. That's it.
And this is not linear. Is it a linear process of understanding time?
I don't understand linear. What do you mean?
Linear means like straight. Is it straight?
No,
It's not straight.
not straight at all.
Then how is it?
Yes, but when you play on or any instrument, people listen to you. And when you have an audience, I've seen you with an audience,
Yes.
and I think it's very difficult for you. I don't think it's easy, but I think you enjoy it. But I think you don't. And when you play drums, people have expectation, and you play with these expectations. We contextualize
Exactly.
Yes.
that.
Mhm.
And he's good with audience. He's very good with audience. And I actually, I'm jealous that you know how to work the audience. Because he plays on the expectation of everybody in this fucking room is expecting a climax. And he's really tensing it, and expanding time, and offering the orgasm, if you like, or the climax of this Hollywood curve of narrative. It's his craft.
This is your craft. To play with a sense of, because every audience individually, they have different sense of time. So how you connect to those different times?
Yeah, he played with his eyes also.
Yes. Yes.
He looks at people and what they expect.
Yes.
And I've seen him play board. And I've seen him look at me when he played a certain line, as if I would have it.
That was Fadi Taiba from Syria, oud player. So we don't have much time to play more in this evening. I'd like to make some concluding remarks, and we'll ask you to participate in this discussion. But before that, I just want to make kind of an outline of what I have been presenting so far, including the introduction, interviews, and the in-depth conversations I was having with artists and practitioners, musicians from the Global South. This is an outline of my postdoctoral research, through which I would like to address the histories and development of sound practice in the Global South in the light of decolonization, recognizing the methodological conflicts as well as confluences between the Eastern and the Western, so to speak, or between northern and southern parts of the globe, seen from the lens of a practicing sound artist from India as a key area of the Global South. The research accommodates a comprehensive study into the histories of aesthetic practice with sound in film, music, performing arts, media arts, in the light of the processes of artistic transfer and exchange in a transcultural, decolonial, and global perspective. The research findings from the proposed project, from the ongoing project, will form a number of scholarly articles and a book publication. In an effort to communicate the research to a wider public globally, a series of workshops is organized, inviting scholars from European colleagues in the field of media art history and sound studies. Attending to disparate aspects of sound in South Asia, North Africa, and Southeast Asia, and the Middle East, of course, may broaden the scope of sound studies and challenges some of the field's central presuppositions. The opening up of the discourse by inviting contributions from the many scholars, thinkers, artists of the Global South may enlighten the knowledge how the uses of technology complicates the narratives of modernity, and how sound making and listening in diverse global settings unsettle familiar binaries of subject and object, sacred and secular, private and public, human, non-human, male, female, and privileged modes of listening, knowledge production, and thinking around sound. In this view, my work, among many other re-emerging Asian, African, and other researchers, aims to build an improved, expansive, and inclusive body of scholarship around sound and listening, capable of hosting a multiplicity of tastes, colors, and splendors, holding pleasure in sharing knowledge among ever curious and open minds.